Hi, this is Tim Pack from Terra Systems. Today's topic I wanted to talk a little bit about is remediation and the history of in situ chemical oxidation. I get this question a bit, how long has ISCO been around? What does it all mean? And how does it fit into the bigger picture of remediation? So I thought it would be interesting to take a look back, if you will. Why? Well, for those who don't remember the past are condemned to repeat it. The quote from George Centenaire, which I really like. It's always valuable, I think, to look back and say, how did this industry get started? And how long ago was it? Well, the answer is not very long ago, surprisingly. Before the 1960s, there was very little energy focused on environmental issues. Uncontrolled dumps were the norm. People were filling in wetlands and lowlands and not paying any attention to what they were dumping into the ground. The first area that things started to kick back, the environment started speaking back to us, was in the area of smog and air pollution, when people started getting sick breathing the air. In particular California, LA, but mostly the big cities. The air was unfit to breathe, people were getting sick. That was a problem. A couple other things happened. The Cuyahoga River fire in Ohio, 1969, when the river caught on fire, kind of an interesting activity for those who might remember that way back when. Love Canal, New York, 1969. Times Beach, Missouri, 1972. Woburn, Massachusetts, 1978, which was the basis of the movie A Civil Action, for those who haven't seen it. And the Valley of the Drums in Kentucky, 1979. 1969 was the book Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, talking about pesticides and its impact on bird populations. Really got the environmental impact industry going. So again, before the 1960s, not much going on. That was when we first started regulating air. We didn't follow until 1970 with the Clean Air Act. But things take time. It takes a while to move legislation through the process. But again, air was the beginnings of it, and then soil and groundwater. So if we look back on the industry starting around the 1960s, what did we have for remediation technologies back then? Well, we had landfilling, dig it up, haul it away, make it somebody else's problem. We had incineration, dig it up, burn it, and dispose of the sludge and waste. We had the development of pump and treat type technologies. Pump it out of the ground, create a cone of depression, externally treat the material, recharge it or discharge to it. And we had the development of in situ and ex situ aerobic bioremediation. This was about the time that geophysics came on board. Geophysics was already used in the oil industry, as were all these other technologies, but we started to bring geophysics into the realm of, how can we use this from an environmental perspective? The 1980s saw the development of things such as soil vapor extraction, including the dual phase approach, the beginnings of in situ chemical oxidation. Zero valent iron was developed for barrier type technologies, injection type technologies. The 1990s started to see anaerobic bioremediation, in situ chemical reduction, monitored natural attenuation, risk assessment. Things were starting to take off. The point I wanted to make here, the 1960s and 1970s, we were really taking existing technologies that were used for oil patch construction type activities and applying them to remediation. We were developing new technologies in the sense of bioremediation. Aerobically, the first technology to come along and actually provide contaminant destruction. 1980s, we started applying engineering type activities to the site with SVE, ISCO, ISCR type technologies, and then we saw the technologies develop further into the 1990s. So from an ISCO point of view, personal preference, when did things develop? Well, technology, the research and development was the early 90s when you saw Waterloo University doing predominantly the preliminary research in ISCO. At that same time, we had technologies being developed by commercial firms. They were looking at, this is an interesting process. How do we do it? To my knowledge, and I could be wrong, the first implementation domestically was in Maine around 1997. And we'll speak more specifically about that at a later session. And around the same time period, Adelaide, Australia. It was the first international site. And from the late 90s, we started doing treatability tests, pilot tests, full-scale applications, and they became too numerous to mention. But the point I wanted to make is, as a technology, this really began being commercialized in the late 1990s. It was initially developed in academia and then brought to commercial implementation going forward roundabout then. So how does this play into the later developments? Well, in the 2000s, we started to see other technologies coming along, in situ thermal treatments, and the optimization of remedial technologies. We started to realize certain things work in certain areas and not other areas. What does that mean, and how do we need to change those? There was the realization that there is no silver bullet. There's no one magical technology that's going to come along and treat all our problems at all our sites and be applicable everywhere. That was a major realization for the environmental industry. We were always looking for that one thing that's going to take us to closure at all our sites. It was initially thought pump and treat was going to be it. Well, that didn't work. It was pump and treat with recharge, recirculation. That was going to be it. Well, that didn't do it either. SVE with air sparging, SVE multi-phase extraction. We'll suck the vapor out of everything. And each of those technologies had, the rainbow period of implementation where everything was working, and then things didn't work. So the 2000s was the realization of combined remedies and treatment train approaches were most applicable. This was also when in situ sorption technologies started being applied and the development of EK methods, electrokinetic methods, became important, particularly for the treatment of fine areas. What I've shown in blue is just coincident with the technology changes were other changes that were happening in the industry, the development of the triad approach, risk-based closures, realization of NAPL flow, DNAPLs, LNAPLs. They don't flow as simply as floating or sinking on the groundwater table and easily recoverable as we showed in the cartoons of the 80s and 90s. Started to see passive diffusion bags coming into being in the 2000s. The technology's changing, the technology's refining itself. Circa 2006 is when we started to have the term sustainable remediation entering the lexicon with the establishment of the SURF organization. And in 2008, EPA's Green and Sustainable Remediation GSR program started happening. Looking back where we are in 2021, these weren't that long ago that these new approaches to consideration of technology started to be implemented in the field. Since then, we've had a whole variety of other things, and I'd love to put in Billy Joel's I Go to Extremes here so you could see the blooming, if you will, of new technologies, new approaches in the last 10 to 15 years. Matrix diffusion, back diffusion. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, but just to realize, high resolution site characterization tools and visualization approaches for them, the on-site tools, recognition of LNAPL transmissivity and recoverability, emerging contaminants and new things coming out with 1,4-dioxane, PFAS, pharmas, EDRs, perchlorates, recognition of natural source zone depletions, EMDs, CSIA, vapor intrusion, etc., etc. The technology is indeed changing over time. We are moving forward as an industry, and we are developing new approaches for looking at things from this humble start in the 1960s. Terra Systems, we've lived that. Richard Raymond and his dad were the developers of bioremediation type technologies in the not too distant past. Something to keep in mind going forward. Terra Systems were focused on custom formulations and treatment train type approaches, finding the approach that works best for your individual site and how we could help. So again, these are our principles. These are the people who've been around for long periods of time, have experience in the industry, and we're happy to help and assist in any way we can. Thanks for listening. I was glad to have a look back on the development of remediation going forward. And I think it's important to have that understanding so you can appreciate where we are, where we came from. Thanks so much for listening.